So we have the Kazekages. Who did that job the best? I'll tell you right now who the worst one is, and I don't think anybody's gonna disagree with me. They shouldn't. It's the second Kazekage. He did the worst job. This is the guy who has the snake on his face. We do not know shit about this guy, right? All we know is that he was at the first Kage summit with the first Kazekage, and he like witnessed that shit go down. And then also we understand that he was probably killed off due to infighting in the Sand Village. You know, people killing him off, so I guess somebody else could take over. The person who came after him. That was possibility, and it is definitely a possibility because the guy who came after him was like cool with like the fucking well, he's on this list, so we'll talk about him later. Um, we have, well, he's actually the next one on the list. So the second Kazekage did the worst job as Kazekage. He was only there for a little bit of years and other things. He got killed off. Now the third Kazekage was powerful, right? But he's at number 4 because he had a lapse in judgment. But fucking cool and other things, man. Um, it made sense, right? So basically, the third Kazekage came into power, and there was wars going on. Who were like notable ninjas in the like Sand Village at the time, right? It was, God damn it, what the fuck is her name? Chio. She was a puppet, master, right? She was good at the puppet jutsus. She also knew how to like, treat people, from injuries and also create poison. Her family was favored. She eventually became a fucking old hag and became a fucking, elder of the village. She was well respected. And from that, her family is too, because guess what? Sorcery of the red sand, he was a fucking sand ninja, brother. Like, do you not remember that? He was part of the sand village. He killed the third music or the third Kazekage, right? Killed this guy. I'm saying he's the fourth on this. He's fourth on this list because he had a lapse in judgment. You don't like. It's much like the second Raikage. You know, you don't keep snakes around you. You know, people that are gonna like turn against you. He thought, okay, sorcery's cool, Chio, she helped us out in the wars. She's, a great puppet master. He's just like her, if not better, he would never. And then the next minute, like he's as soon as his guard's down, this nigga fucking pulls up on him, kills his ass. And this is a thing. And this is just me, you know. I don't know about how other people feel in the community, but let me know in the comments if you do. The third Mizukage was fucking. He was not weak. This is like he had iron sand jutsu, right? This is not something that just anybody can fucking use, right? You know, and he was known as one of the more powerful, Kazakages of like that village, right? And they when he died and shit, they were like scrambling. They were like, "Oh my god, like what the fuck are we gonna do?" You know, this guy was, one of the fucking guys. So this is what tells me that sorcery, um, man, he just poisoned him. He snuck him. He was like basically his guard was down. He was like, oh, sorcery would never, do that. He's a loyal friend. Boom, he gets hit by some poison. And this poison, like sorcery's poison is not, nothing to sneeze at, boy. You know, Orochimaru was trying to learn sorcery's dick so he could, get better poison than sorcery. And that's the truth, you know. So that happened, right? He had a lapse in judgment. He kept a like weak ass circle around him, much like the second Raikage. Now we get to the third position, right? Who was in the third position now? That's the first Kazekage. Without him bringing all the people that like sand, the people of that area together and creating the village in the sand, there would be no Kazekage. Um, Wind shadow. Because they he calls the land of wind. You know, and he's like the ruler of the Hidden Sand Village, and he's caused the feudal lord of the land of wind. Um, he you know he kept the tail beast shit like on lock because he understood that like he kind of like he didn't get a shitty deal, right? So there was three nations that got two tail beasts and then one that didn't, or two that didn't. Hashirama got the nine tails and then he got the one tails, and he's like, okay, hold on, we're gonna keep our tail beast just locked down. We are not gonna let him run around and do shit or at all. And it was like, I ain't saying what he did was like right, but it like or was like, whatever, but he had to lock that shit down because guess what? You know, had it been out in the open and other things, they could have another village could have came in and stole the Shikaku from them, and then they don't have shit, right? He had to keep the Shikaku locked inside of somebody and everything else. And I say this because there was an old man who kept this tail beast inside of him, and it started with this guy. Like he was a baby during this time, right? He got the Shikaku sealed in him, and then he died, and then guess who became the Shikaku holder after that? It was Gaara. So this old man, this guy, kept he was in a cage for like his whole life. All he got was food, and that's it. He never got to go outside or anything. And it started with this guy. Now that was kind of fucked up, right? How he did that. Other people would have like, used them as like military powers. Okay, they still have like sanctions on the nigga, but like you can still like go out on missions and other things on our behalf and other things, right? He wasn't doing that. He was going to take that chance because they only had one Jinchuriki. Now he was thinking, and he was, he didn't want to lose that, power that they have and shit. These other villages have two fucking tailed beasts. We got a short end. Man, I'm locking this shit up. I don't blame him for that. Too much. You know, so he's at number 3. At number 2, I have Rasa. That is Gaara's father. Rasa then, decided to, okay, we'll like use the tail beast. Well, I'll seal it inside of my son and we can use it to like, fight against other villages if need be. But he also still had good diplomatic relationships with the Leaf Village because guess what? They wouldn't have had the Sand Village at the tuning exams in the Leaf Village had they not had good relations, brother. You know, and sisters, they had good relationships, so he knew how to talk and shit, right? Now he had no idea that he was gonna get clipped by Orochimaru and Kabuto. They want to hunt his dick, and then wear his skin. After that, he didn't know none of that. Now this is where he kind of messed up, right? He turned his son into a fucking killer and shit. And like the type of guy who would like kill his own fucking people and shit. If you like ticked him off the wrong way, he kind of like created the like problem in a way, but he was like also like trying to like, militarize or, use Gaara as a power to like, defend the, sand. But the way he did it was like kind of unhealthy, it kind of was, man. The way they did Naruto was not the way they did Gaara, and Gaara, he kind of suffered for it, you know. He had, the gold dust. He could weigh down the Shikaku. So he had to fight the Shikaku and seal it back in the sun, a couple of times. He was like, oh, fucking cool, And he got tired of it and other things. So he tried to kill Gar and, it didn't work out. And, so he had problems and other things. But out of like all the other ones that I've named and shit, I think he did better. Even with that, he still did better than them. Now, by hands down, boy, the best Kazekage was our boy Gaara, right? So, it's Naruto and da 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 about Naruto and shit. We understand that Naruto's about Naruto. We do, over here. But, let niggas speak real quick. Gaara had it fucking worse, in some ways, man. Because his mother died. His father hated him for that, by the way. had he not been the way he was, um, maybe she would still be there. He missed her. I know that about Rasa, right? So he hated his son, and then that led to him, sending um, the one guy who's like basically his like uncle or whatever, to kill him, and then Gar kills him, and then he's like, all fucked up after that, and he's like, I'll kill anybody, I feel no love from anybody, he's fighting, and then Naruto comes in, there's like Naruto beats him, and he's like, yo, goddamn man, I understand how that's like, you know, nobody else understands, but it's not a good feeling, is it? And then he's like, yeah, it's not a good feeling. He didn't say that, but he, basically understood because he knew that Naruto was like the same kind of fucking person as him. So then he went and he put in the fucking work too. Cause see, the elders of the Hidden Sand Village were against him. And they were, they're like, oh, this guy's, he could turn on us at any time. But, other people started seeing him come up and other things. And in the 2.5 years, this man became the Kazekage of the Sand Village. Despite what those elders and other people were saying, riding his fucking dick about being a fucking Jinchuriki and other things, right? You know, he still did that thing. Not only this, he protected the village. See, he protected the village, and he was like, okay, if I'm fighting Datara and I'm summoning all this sand from the ground, right? All this sand comes down on my people, they're gonna die from this shit. There's women and children down there who cannot, defend it. Like if this falls on them, they'll die. So he had to, push that aside. I'm saying that basically Gaara could have probably beat Datara had they fought outside of the village. I'm not saying that he would have like won, definitively, but he probably had a better chance of beating him, and he probably might have won, if you ask me. Um, but since he was fighting in the village, he had to like get that sand out of there. That takes a lot of chakra away from him. I don't think people miss that shit. I did not miss that shit at all. He had to put all that sand outside the village. That takes time and other things. Data is already winding up a strategy in his head to like, fuck with Gaara and, eventually defeat him. And that's what happened. Now they were, without a Kazekage for a little bit, but then, he got lucky. Chiyo gave up her life and he came back. Then he, went to the Five Kage Summit later. He brought up, how he was, he was like, hey, I have experience with this shit. So, you people gotta like take this shit seriously. I was taken from my fucking village. They killed me, and I'm grateful to still be alive right now. You know, this is not something that we should, sleep on. This Akatsuki issue, we need to make something come from this meeting. You guys use the Akatsuki in the past. You guys like, forsake yourself. You don't care about, people and the lives of, those kind of people, right? There's still, people that, are important, right? Jinchurikis, that kind of thing. He was then able to, become a leader of the Allied Shinobi forces. He was out there fighting against his father who was recouped, and he beat him. He sealed him away and shit. So he had the power, and he had the, love of his people too. He actually cared about their safety and shit. He showed a lot of development too. So, you know, I think Gar is the best Kazekage out of all of them. Um, but be cool, call in the corner, and let me know what you think about that in the comments below.